Republican Congressman Will Hurd of Texas is joining us. He's a member of the Intelligence Committee, a former CIA clandestine officer as well. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. And I know you, like all your colleagues now, have received a briefing, a classified briefing on the situation with Iran. Based on the evidence you saw, are you convinced that an attack from Soleimani was imminent against Americans?
I do. You had some very sophisticated consumers of intelligence that talked about how credible this information was. There was a level of specificity. But I could go even further beyond this immediate threat. Qasem Soleimani has been a threat, an acute threat to the United States for a very long time. And taking him off the battlefield has had a significant impact. It showed the Iranian regime that there's going to be consequences to their reign of terror. And making sure that I know today the replacement for Soleimani is looking over his shoulder. Other Iranian generals are double checking and thinking again about the decisions that they can ultimately make. And we have to remember that these Iranian generals are not interested in becoming martyrs. They want to live long lives, and I'm sure this has given them pause about leaving Tehran or the safety of Iran. And we should respond to attacks and potential attacks on our facilities, on our people, on our allies. I've been in an embassy that was hit by rockets. I've been in an embassy that was almost overrun in my previous life in the CIA, and we should be making sure that we're sending a message to our diplomatic staff and our military that we're going to protect them when this does happen.
But at the same time, and you just heard, lawmakers from both parties have some very sharp criticism of the briefings they've been receiving today. You heard Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah calling it, in his words, the worst briefing I've had on a military issue in my 9 years in the Senate. Those are his words. Rand Paul also not very happy with what he heard. I'm going to be speaking with him later here in the Situation Room. So how do you emerge saying it's all good, and they emerge saying this was a disaster?
Well, it was two separate briefings, but I believe it was the same individuals. I'm sure the details were the same. Here's my belief. Qasem Soleimani was the head of the most well-armed, well-equipped terrorist organization in the world, and this is what happens to head of terrorist organizations. It wasn't like we hit him in the middle of Tehran. He was in Baghdad. He wasn't transiting through Baghdad to go to Barbados on vacation. He was there in order to work with their proxy elements, in order to attack further Americans, in order to attack our allies. And I do not believe that a terrorist gets to hide behind the uniform of their country. You can't hide behind that. You are still a terrorist. And so if this was an attack in Iran, I think we'd be having a different conversation. I don't think anybody is interested in a World War III or an attack inside the country of Iran. And so I think that's where some of these debates are. I think having a debate is healthy, making sure that our men and women in the military understand that we're thinking about this use of great American power, and that we're putting them in harm's way, and we're having these kinds of debates. So I think that may be where the difference of debate is, but ultimately I believe taking Qasem Soleimani off the battlefield was a good thing. And what we are seeing is a continuation of what the Army War College, when they did a study, I believe it was at the end of 2018, when you look at Iranian behavior and there's no consequences, and they're not seeing consequences, they continue to escalate activities in a place like Iraq. And now what we see in their response with the 15 missile launch into Iraq last night, this was, I think, a further data point to show that they're going to change their behavior. I believe this was a face-saving attempt by the Iranian regime. We know that, and you talked about it in the previous segment, Wolf, about how the Iranian state media is claiming, I think it was 80 Americans were killed. We know that is a lie. We know that didn't happen. And so they're showing pictures of these launches, and they're using information operations with their own people. I think the next steps is now we need to be working more with our European allies to have them join this maximum pressure campaign to continue to put pressure on the Iranian to try to make them become a normal country.
You know, we're getting some important new information coming in, Congressman, as we're speaking from our Pentagon correspondents, Barbara Starr and Ryan Brown. Let me read to you what they're now telling us, and we'll get your reaction. The top U.S. general made clear Wednesday night that Iran meant to kill U.S. troops in the ballistic missile attack on U.S. forces in Iraq. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, told reporters Wednesday, and I'm quoting him now, "I believe, based on what I saw and what I know, that they were intended to cause structural damage, destroy vehicles and equipment and aircraft, and to kill personnel. That's my own personal assessment." That's General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And they point out, Barbara Starr and Ryan Brown, that Milley is delivering a very different message from what some other administration officials have floated, that Iran deliberately tried to avoid killing American personnel at those two Iraqi bases. What do you think about that, knowing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, is clearly a very, very serious guy?
Look, I think General Milley is concerned with his troops. I think what we do know is that our troops are dealing in a dangerous world, and that the Iranians have the ability to launch those kinds of attacks. Some of the intelligence questions we should be asking is, were we going to be able to see those attacks in advance, and could have potentially done something in advance? I think that's a broader conversation that Congress could ultimately be in. And what was the interest and the plans and intentions of the Iranian regime when they did those missile launches last night? So one thing we do know, our men and women are in dangerous situations. We should be protecting them. And we also know that you now have the Shia militias that are, in essence, proxy forces for the Iranians, that they have capabilities independent of the Iranian regime. But I also think that they are questioning the commitment of the Iranian government to their activities in Iraq. And we have to remember, why are we seeing increased activity by the Iranians in Iraq? It's because the Iraqi people were sick and tired of an Iranian puppet as the prime minister in Iraq. And they stood up and they protested, and the prime minister said he would step down, and now in a caretaker area. So the Iranians are concerned about losing control of the country. The Shia militias are concerned that their biggest backer could be potentially waffling. So this is still a tricky situation. And this is why we need to make sure that we're working with our allies on this issue.
Yeah, and I'll just leave you with this, because I know you got to run, Congressman. General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, says there were no U.S. casualties because the U.S. military had early warning, various tactics. They took defensive measures, procedures. Quote, "We took sufficient defensive measures that as a result, there were no casualties to U.S. personnel, coalition personnel, contractors, or Iraqis." It's not because the Iranians wanted to avoid U.S. casualties. It's because the U.S. military was smart enough and had early measures to avoid U.S. casualties. An interesting development indeed. We'll continue to follow up on that. Congressman Will Hurd, thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Wolf.